Hello, everyone. Welcome to our African Guyanese History series. Today, we are looking at crime and security. And what I like to do is mention that I'm only going to deal with African Guyanese criminal activities or what constituted a crime during the period of slavery. You know, the time frame for this series is 1626 to 1839. And so I have limited it to 1626 to 1839 and have only identified what was considered a crime during the time of slavery. Okay? Uh, but you are free to continue reading on criminal activities in the post-emancipation period. You know, in 1839, the Guyana police force was established. Of course, subsequently, later on, one will find that with amendments, it later became the British Guiana Police Force. And after that, you will notice that it's not until 1967 that we had our first Guyanese commissioner of police. He was African Guyanese. His name was Felix Austin. But that's not until Guyana became politically independent. Guyana became politically independent in 1966. And then in 1967, there was the first commissioner of police, an African Guyanese, Felix Austin. Let's begin the presentation for today. And I'd like us to begin by looking at the treatment of African Guyanese prior to the emancipation. Of course, it's not different because it's, as I said, it's not until 1967 that we started to have local persons promoted to the level of commissioner of police. Now, in our previous presentations, we had looked at the arrival of Africans to Guyana, the enslaved Africans. Lesson 2 dealt with emancipation. Lesson 3, what is the village movement? And of course, today we are discussing crime and security. And in our discussion, we will cover the following. What is a crime? Punishment for crimes and establishment of the Guyana police force. Sociologists tend to define a crime as antisocial behavior. But in the case of the African Guyanese, during the time of slavery, what one found an action, it was an action or omission, which constitutes an offense and is punishable by law. Here is a list of actions which were considered crimes in the Guyanese slave society. 1, biracial relationships, rebellion, running away, raising one's hand to a white person was deemed a heinous crime, offense, ignoring the curfews, slave marriages, omission, neglect or carelessness with respect to the performance or completion of labor, the faking of sickness in the field, strikes, and later on, female flogging was considered a crime. It was very seldom that the white planters were charged for falsely accusing the enslaved Africans. However, when Juno Freundorf, whose companion Thomas Jansen had the slave woman Maria G put in stocks for allegedly sleeping with a white man. The fiscal found that the accusation was false and the punishment unmerited. Freundorf was fined £300. Now let's look at punishment for crimes. And in 1824, female flogging was abolished. And by 1832, Governor Carmichael Smith had recommended that the planters restrict the use of the house stock, which is practiced by confining the hands and feet in stocks, except in extreme cases. Now, I have here two examples which I'd like to share with you. About the year 1731 and 1732, the company's slaves on plantation Polwick, while Lehman, the director, was away at church, owing to some dispute over tobacco that they had with the cooper, made up their minds to revenge themselves and to run away from the estate. They murdered 4 white servants, sporting and playing ball with the heads. A houseboy of the director escaped and informed the director. The director informed the commander, who gave him some soldiers to assist him. He took 5 of the ringleaders prisoners. The chief instigator was tied to a stake by chains around his arms and legs and burnt with a slow fire. With his back already half roasted, he asked for a pipe of tobacco, which he smoked right out, and then died without the slightest sign of repentance. Next, I'd like us to look at this author excerpt. In 1738, 40 of the company's Creole slaves ran away to the upper river Guyanese, where they settled on Creole Island, planted some provision fields, and fortified themselves. They got some Indians to tell the governor that if he wanted them again, he would have to come and fetch them with all his troops, indeed with the whole of Holland, that they would expect him and were not afraid of him. The commander, recognizing the advantageous situation of this island and the difficulty of attacking and overpowering them there, sent Peter Tollerman there, a mulatto unarmed, with instructions to persuade them in a gentle manner and to conclude a treaty with them, fearing that they would increase in power and get more of the other slaves to join them. Tollerman was successful and made an agreement whereby they and their progeny were to be declared free people, with a proviso that they would work month by month, namely 1 month for the company and 1 month for themselves. They married free Indian women so that their children would not lapse into slavery again, but retain their freedom. Another example of the slaves' resistance to slavery was in 1744, when an Englishman with his wife from Barbados had brought 2 slaves with them and settled in Barbados. While in the forest, the man was dissatisfied with the work of the 2 slaves and had threatened that if they did not make progress, he would sell them. The Negro slaves therefore seized him, and the other struck him on the head with an axe. They then buried him. They later pretended that they didn't know what had become of their master. The grave was discovered and the slaves were duly punished. One was sentenced to have his body nipped 7 times with glowing hot pincers and then to be burnt alive, which, owing to the rain that started falling, proceeded very slowly and lasted 1.5 hours. When already half burned, he said to his mistress, and I quote, "Mistress, you must have brought me into this country to be treated thus," end of quote. The other was strangled and burnt. Let's look at slave marriages. Slave marriages were illegal in the slave society until 19 November 1826. And Reverend John Ray would conduct the wedding ceremonies for the Christian slaves who wanted to be married. One of the things is that some of these couples did not live on the same plantation. And so whenever, for instance, a husband attempted to visit his wife who was residing on another plantation, if he were caught, he would be killed or, beaten. Although it was a simple ceremony, it was dangerous because if Reverend Ray had been caught, he would have been fined and imprisoned. Finally, creation of the Guyana Police Force. The police historian John Campbell wrote that Ordinance Number 9 of 1839 was passed by Governor Light and the Court of Policy on 11th of June 1839, which was later amended by Ordinance Number 28 of 1839. This ordinance authorized the establishment of the police force as an organization for the entire colony of British Guyana under the control of an inspector general instead of the undersheriff. The first Guyanese commissioner of police was appointed in 1967. He was Mr. Felix Austin, an African Guyanese. Here's what we learned from the lesson today, from the presentation today. First, actions which were considered crimes in the Guyanese slave society were punished. Second, the punishment of crimes. Were flogging. These included flogging, being put in the stocks, burning at the stake, beheading, and imprisonment. I should also mention that in some cases, the rebellious enslaved were extradited to Australia, New South Wales, okay? And third, we discussed the creation of the Guyana Police Force. What I'd like to show you this afternoon is the cover of the book by John Campbell on the history of policing in Guyana. John Campbell was a policeman and he was also a historian. So if you can get access to this book, I will be delighted. He mentions in his acknowledgement Muhammad Shahabuddin, who had written on the legal systems in Guyana. And he also mentioned Oret, who had written an earlier copy on the history of the police force in Guyana. With that, I wish to thank you for participating. Our next presentation will be on the Haitian Revolution. Please remember that your handouts and recommended readings are in your chat box. Thank you once again for joining this series. Have a good evening.